So it's one of the most common questions I get asked, and it's probably one of the most popular topics of conversation when classic car people get together. That's, does today's gasoline kill old engines? Is it bad for old engines? And the answer to that is a definite no, maybe, quite possibly. All right, so how does that work out? The main difference, there are two main differences between older blends of gasoline and what we have today. And you have to break this into two categories. The first is ethanol, the ethanol blends that we have. Now the answer to that is an absolute definite no. Ethanol blends have no negative effects inside the internal combustion engine at all. Where you have problems with ethanol is in the fuel system. And it's primarily in engines, small engines let's say, that have fuel systems that don't allow the gasoline or the fuel to evaporate into the atmosphere. So let's just say, for example, you've got a lawnmower and you've got ethanol gas in it and you shut it off for the season and you park it. While it's sitting, the gasoline starts to turn rancid. The worst parts of it head to the bottom of the float bowl, and as it evaporates slowly, more fuel comes in from the tank, and it doesn't allow everything to just evaporate out of the bowl. So at that point you get that crusty crud that clogs up the jets and does all kinds of nasty things. In a carbureted car engine, we don't really have that problem. As long as the float bowls are open to the atmosphere and the gasoline is allowed to evaporate out, and the gas tank is vented and the gasoline is allowed to evaporate out, we really don't have those problems. You do have other problems, mostly having to do with rubber fuel lines. The ethanol isn't friendly with the rubber. You have some drivability issues, you've got vapor-like issues, boiling over issues. You've got the situation where after the car sits for a couple of days, they're hard to restart because all of the gasoline is evaporated out of the fuel system. And it has to be pumped back up from the tank. But as far as detrimental effects of the engine itself, inside the engine itself, no, none at all. It's perfectly safe to use. It actually works very well. Now lead, on the other hand, is an issue, and that's what we want to talk about here today. By the way, we did a lot of videos on the specifics of ethanol and fuel systems and so on and so forth. So if you're really curious, you can go back and search that. So lead, actually technically tetraethyl lead. So to understand what lead does and why they had it and how it affects what goes on inside of an engine, you have to kind of understand the history of the internal combustion engine. So you got to go back to the very beginning. So the first 20 years or so that we had cars, we had the internal combustion engine out doing its thing, we really didn't have roads. So travel speeds were very slow, 20 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour like tops. Compression ratios were very low. These things didn't need a lot of horsepower. So 5-to-1, 6-to-1, 7-to-1 compression ratios, actually 7-to-1 was really high. The compression ratios were low, the fuel quality was hit and miss, but they were low enough that it would run on kerosene. It would just chug on down the road. But now in the 1920s, the infrastructure started to catch up to the capabilities of the cars, actually started to surpass the capabilities of the cars. And so the manufacturers started raising compression ratios. So once compression ratios got into the 8-to-1, 9-to-1 range, now spark knock became a problem. Detonation. So to combat that, they started adding small amounts of tetraethyl lead to the gasoline. So basically the tetraethyl lead, was an octane booster. And that was all good. Now you get to the post-war expansion era, when the suburbs started to come into play and the interstate highway system started to come into play and travel speeds were raised, and now you had much higher compression engines. You had them in the 9-10-to-1 range, and they were under a load. They were traveling at 60, 70 miles an hour, pushing a lot of wind. And so you needed a higher level of gas. And that's where the term ethyl came in. Ethyl used to be the term for premium gas. And what the refiners did was just add more tetraethyl lead, and that not only reduced the spark knock, but it also helped combat valve seat wear. So here's what happened. In the early days, valve seat wear wasn't really a problem. You take a typical car from the 19 teens and 1920s, at 10,000 miles, this thing was like done, because it had just chugged along through its whole life. wear wasn't really an issue. Valve seat etching wasn't really an issue. You get to the highway era now, you get to the interstate era, and now it's starting to become a problem. Because as the engine's going down the road, the exhaust valve gets very hot. And as it gets hot, it starts to etch metal from the seat. But we're going to get to that in a minute. So, the EPA, there was a movement in the late 1960s to start taking lead out of gasoline, out of everything for that matter. What happened was, once you got to the 1950s, 1960s, the inner cities had a lot of traffic, a lot of exhaust fumes. It was pretty harsh. And there was a lot of lead in the air as a result of the burning of it in internal combustion engines. And they started to find developmental issues in younger inner city kids because they were lead poisoning. They had lead poisoning. They started taking the lead out of paint at that time also because little kids would eat paint chips, right? So, I mean, of all of the nonsensical, berserk, crazy things that the government and the EPA has done over the years, pulling lead out of the fuel was actually a really good idea. So that started in the 1960s. But lead was still a component of gasoline. When the EPA decided that beginning in 1975 everybody was going to have to adopt a catalytic converter, one of the things that had to be done was pull the lead out of gasoline because the lead would coat the catalyst. The same way it coats the exhaust valve seats on an engine, it would also coat the heated part of the catalytic converter, thus making it useless or clogging it. So, beginning in 1975, that was mandated, the catalytic converter, and unleaded gas came into being. Because the automakers knew about this and anticipated it, beginning in 1971, they started hardening the exhaust valve seats of their regular production engines, figuring that you sold a 1971 car, it's still in service in 1975 when unleaded gas is in, and no good. So they started hardening the seats at that point. And that's kind of like where your definite maybe comes in. Basically, if you got an engine that was built before 1971, 1972, it has soft valve seats. Or I should say the valve seats, the exhaust valve seats, are the same composition as the rest of the cylinder head. So we know that engines manufactured after 1971 or so have hardened valve seats. Does that mean that you've got an earlier engine, you either need to use a lead substitute or have hardened seats installed in your heads? The answer to that is a definite possibly. And I say that because not all cylinder heads are the same. I've torn apart countless 1960s engines, and some of them have absolutely no valve seat wear at all. And others are just destroyed. The valve's totally sunk into the head. And the reason for that is that not all manufacturers use the same composition of metal when they cast their parts. Some are cast more resistant to that etching than others. And the perfect example of that is this 516 Chrysler head, which had to spend at least 20 or 30 years of its life running on unleaded fuel. And it shows almost no valve seat wear at all. But now, what is valve seat wear? And okay, so as the engine is running and the exhaust valve is going through its hundreds of millions of opening and closing cycles, the outer edge of the exhaust valve is extremely hot. And what it's doing is, as it's running, it's micro etching. It's taking microscopic bits of metal from the seat. And as it does that, it drops lower and lower and lower. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the valve won't seal. I've had engines that had completely sunk valves, I mean way down a hole, but yet they still sealed. Because as the engine is running, this is all done on, I guess it's a micro level, it'll etch the material pretty much evenly and the valve will retain its seal. But this is detrimental for two reasons. The first, from a performance perspective, is that the further you drop the valve, the worse the flow is. Meaning that the cam has to open the valve that much further before it actually allows flow through it. So that's how you want to keep the valve at the surface of the combustion chamber. The more detrimental reason from a drivability standpoint is that as the valve sinks further and further into the head, it's pushing up on the rocker, which is pushing down on the push rod, and it's increasing the preload in the lifter. So the further down into the lifter you go, into the lifter plunger you go, the more likely it is to want to pump up, let's say at highway speed. So you'll start to develop misses, higher RPM. When I say higher RPM, in this case, 3,000, 4,000 RPM, you'll start to get a miss. And that's because the valve isn't being allowed to return to its seat. So that's where the problem is. Well, that's why it becomes a problem. So how do you know if you need to put hardened seats in your engine? So here's the easiest, or use a lead substitute. Although, I tell you the truth, by the time you get to this point, adding a lead substitute, it's too late. Like the cow's already out of the barn. So if you've got sunk seats, you can add all of the lead substitute you want. You're not going to reverse the process. So here's the quickest, easiest way to know if you've got a problem happening inside your engine. We'll use this one. So as the seat wears, as the valve begins to sink into the seat, obviously this will be higher. So the quickest, easiest way to know whether you need to actually look into replacing the valve seats or having hardened seats installed in the cylinder head is to just take a straight edge, pop the valve cover off, take a straight edge, and lay it over the valve springs. Actually, over the retainers. You don't even have to take the rocker train apart to do this. You can lay it over the retainers. And if you see any of them that are sitting high, that means that that exhaust seat is worn and it's pushed up. So at that point, you know you've got an issue. On the other hand, you lay a straight edge and everything looks good. Let's say it's a 1962 small block Chevy and you've been running it on unleaded for however long. You check that engine, and if they're all relatively even, you got nothing to worry about. So that's it. That's the long and the short of it. Does today's gasoline kill vintage engines? It doesn't kill them, but it can hurt them. It can handicap them a bit. And like I said, your choice, you could take your cylinder heads and run it to a machine shop, let them cut the old seats out, install hardened seats, you're good to go, or use a set of aftermarket heads. All of the aftermarket heads already have hardened seats already in them. So that's it. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.